The ethics of street photography. Now, if ever there's a topic that sends the keyboard warriors into overdrive and sends shivers down your spine, then it's this one. So in this special edition of the show, we're going to be having a deep dive into street photography ethics. And I'll try to give you a sensible and workable overview. But having said that, my ethics are mine and your ethics are yours, so I certainly won't be trying to tell you what to do. I'll just be putting some of the arguments on the table so you can decide. So in this bumper edition, we're going to look at topics like consent, exploitation, misrepresentation, cultural sensitivity, shooting children, and more. And in the process, we'll take some questions from you. Let me throw this straight back at you. Do you struggle with the ethics of street photography? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But most of us question what we're doing to some degree, either before, during, or sometimes after the picture-taking process. Now, it's not my job to tell you what your ethics should be. We all have a very different ethical or moral code, and what's right for me isn't necessarily right for you. But it's a discussion we should still have. Now, personally, I'm very conscious of being ethical, and I'll always do my best. But I don't really let it get in the way. It's one of those subjects where it's too easy to overthink it and let it hold us back, which in my experience is usually a mistake. So let's start with the issues. What are these ethical issues we're talking about, and how do we deal with them? So the first one is around consent. And this is perhaps the central dilemma for us. Now, it's a universally accepted proposition in street photography that our work is nearly always candid. So, accepting this premise, it's obvious that seeking permission will probably destroy the moment, and that not asking permission removes the subject's agency. So how do we square this? The more we think about it, the more it's clear that street photography sits right on an ethical fault line. It exists on the basis of spontaneity and truth, but often involves photographing people who haven't consented. And it's exactly that tension that makes street photography so powerful and controversial. Look at street photographers like Gary Winogrand. He built a modus operandi around the unposed, fleeting, authentic moment. But today, many people will argue that this authenticity doesn't automatically justify lack of consent. So the ethical question then becomes, is the value of the image enough to override the subject's right to choose? But let's just hold it there. In fact, no, we'll row back a little and really think about what we're doing with street photography. We are generally, not always, generally recording life on the street. And this is a perfectly normal activity, unless we, as the photographers, decide otherwise. That is, we have different motives. Consent isn't a binary concept, and we can look at it from three perspectives. Firstly, there's implicit consent. Somebody sees you, maybe they don't, but they don't object. You take the picture, everything carries on normally, naturally, everybody's happy. Then secondly, there's post-shot consent. You take the photo, then you engage with them, maybe you show them the picture, maybe you don't, maybe you ask them if it's okay, and then maybe connect with them in some way. And that's all fine. Then there's, finally, explicit consent. And this is where you ask up front. And this is more common in documentary than street photography, but it's, typically it's what we would do for street portraits. You ask for consent, it's explicit, they say yes, everybody's happy. So each of these has a different effect on spontaneity and authenticity. When I'm shooting myself, it's almost always a case of no consent. Very occasionally it's post-shoot consent. And that's because I strongly believe that street photography needs to be candid. Okay, now we're leaving street portraits out of it for this discussion because that's obviously a very different thing. But looking at it from the legal, the very black and white perspective, if a person is in a public place, certainly in the UK, and in most developed countries, not all, but most, if a person's in a public place, then their right to privacy is almost non-existent. I know some European countries have much tighter privacy laws than we do, but, in the UK, USA, Australia, if you're in public, you have no expectation of privacy. And people are getting their faces and their activities recorded constantly by shops, by railway stations, by the state. And actually, this one troubles me slightly, the state. So why should there be a problem being photographed by us? Let's face it, if we always had to ask for consent, then street photography would die a death, and none of us wants this. Okay, I could philosophise about the nature and the true meaning of consent until the cows come home, but I just don't think I'm that boring. So as far as consent goes, this is my starting point. Consent, for me at least, is implied because people are out there in public. Unless other factors come into play which may remove that consent, and we'll maybe get into this territory a bit later on. So therefore, in my world, consent simply doesn't come into it. But this is only the first piece of the jigsaw. So next we'll look at the issue of exploitation. And this is especially relevant when photographing, say, homeless people, children, people in distress, vulnerable people, possibly the elderly. There's always a danger that street photography can aestheticize, is that a word? Aestheticize, make aesthetic? Aestheticize the social problems or turn people into opportunist visual subjects rather than individuals. And what seems to be the get-out clause for street photographers often is, but it's documentary, or it's real life. We can't just erase these issues. We can't ignore these issues. So, you typically see this in street photography when you've got some poor homeless guy asleep on a bench and a street photographer goes up and pokes a camera in his face and says, I'm doing it for documentary reasons, when actually they're not. They're doing it because they want a load of likes on Instagram. We'll come back to this. But to help explain this, let's take one of your questions on this issue. And this one's from Stephen.
Hi, Brian. Stephen from Wiltshire here. A question on ethics. So I've been a fan of documentary photography for a while now. It's what started my interest in street photography. I don't think I've produced any documentary projects of note myself. However, my photographic book collection contains a majority of documentary work, particularly social documentary. My point is that the ethical framework in some of this work could be described as quote-unquote loose, and that's my opinion. But to me, that's a good thing, as this genre of photography demands it if it wants to be a credible historical record. I see parallels in documentary and street photography, but it seems to me we have a different set of ethics, and while some documentary work has a permission of subjects, a lot certainly doesn't. So I was wondering, do you think there's a different set of ethical rules for street and documentary? If so, what can we learn and possibly employ from the documentary approach in our work, the street photographers? Great podcast, by the way, Brian. Keep up the good work.
Well, I think the big ethical issue is, are you documenting reality with a true documentary intent? This is the key word. And yes, it is all about intent. Or are you using somebody else's situation for your own artistic gain? If you're chasing likes on Instagram or entering camera club competitions with this stuff, then it definitely falls into the latter category. And for me, that's just a no-no. Is there overlap between street and documentary as far as ethics is concerned? Yeah, but the ethical centre of gravity is different with the two genres. Street and documentary both deal with real people in real situations, but they do ask slightly different moral questions. Street is more about observation and interpretation, whereas documentary carries a stronger obligation towards truth and responsibility towards subjects. We're less concerned with that in street. But let's go back to intent. Sure, plenty of problematic images are made with, in quotes, good intentions. But what matters more is how the image functions. Who benefits? Who is reduced in the process? If a picture turns somebody into a symbol, poverty, loneliness, eccentricity, whatever, without their awareness, their permission, or their agency, that's where exploitation starts to creep in. Let's hear another question about this, and this one is from Michael. Take it away, Michael.
Hi, Brian. Michael here from Norfolk. At what point does a street photography image transition from documenting public life to becoming something that conflicts with privacy laws, involved imagery of vulnerable individuals such as children and the homeless, or causes distress and or harassment to the public? Many thanks, Brian. And as always, these podcasts are truly interesting. Keep up the good work.
So if I'm reading this correctly, Michael is asking about the boundary between documenting life in public and taking those shots of difficult subjects. Again, I think this comes back to what's in the photographer's head when they took the picture. What was their intention? If the intention was to create what you might call an important body of documentary work, whatever that means, take the work of Nan Goldin, for example, or Jill Friedman, or Susanna Stein. Goldin is a great example, in fact. And if we look at her AIDS-related work in the 1980s, it was very punchy and hard-hitting, and it served a purpose. If some of those images were used to enter street photography competitions or just bunged on Instagram for likes, they would quite rightly be seen as exploitative. But then we can also look at the issue of exploitation from the perspective of power. And this is an interesting word. We photographers often have social or economic or cultural distance from our subjects. Think of the difference between photographing, let's say, an immaculately suited stockbroker in the city versus a homeless person. One has institutional power. The other is already exposed. That same act, taking a candid picture, lands very differently depending on that imbalance. I'm sorry about the drilling in the background. Our neighbours have got something going on and there are diggers and all drills and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, there's a long tradition of this kind of tension in the work of street photographers. Look at people like Diane Arbus, whose portraits are often debated. Are they empathetic or voyeuristic? Or Bruce Gilden's confrontational style, which raises questions about intrusion and dignity. Their work's quite valuable to study, not as a model to copy blindly necessarily, but as a way to just think about it and maybe sharpen your own ethical line. And here are a few practical ways to think about this in your own shooting. Firstly, if an image relies on somebody's vulnerability, ask yourself whether you are revealing something meaningful and somehow useful about them, or are you just capitalizing on it? Secondly, consider whether the subject would feel misrepresented or exposed if they saw the image. Then be careful of unintended or intended voyeurism, framing people as curiosities or as oddities rather than individuals. Then think about context. Photographing people in your own community versus dropping them into unfamiliar environments can change the ethical weight of what you're doing. And then finally, it's in the editing where exploitation often happens. And you could have an image that is harmless in isolation, but it becomes exploitative when it's sequenced or captioned in a certain way. Okay, let's look at the issue of context and misrepresentation, which we've hinted at already. A street photograph isolates a moment, often stripping away context. Think about the consequences of this. It could mislead viewers. It could reinforce stereotypes. It could even create false narratives. Misrepresentation isn't necessarily about outright lying. It's more about framing, selection, or the collapse of context. You can photograph something that genuinely happened and still create a misleading impression. Every time you lift the camera, you're choosing, you're making the decision what to include and what to exclude. A tight crop can turn an ambiguous moment into something loaded, maybe with tension, loneliness, conflict, whatever, when the wider scene might dilute or even contradict that first reading. The viewer assumes that the frame is representative, whereas in reality, it's interpretive. What power we've got. Then there are issues around timing. A split second before or after can completely change meaning or interpretation. A gesture that looks aggressive could be quite the opposite. We often celebrate, thanks Henri, the decisive moment, but that moment can just as easily misrepresent the flow of events as it can clarify it. And what about context? When an image is removed from its original setting, whether that's geographic, cultural, temporal, it becomes vulnerable to being misread. It becomes exposed. A scene that makes perfect sense in one social context can look strange, humorous, even disturbing somewhere else. And once published, especially online, you lose control. You, as the creator, the photographer, lose control over how it's interpreted. And we've got to think about this. Gosh, this is all very heavy, isn't it? Let's relax for a minute and take a short break. I'd love to play you some Pink Floyd, but I'd get absolutely clobbered under copyright law, so we have to have royalty free. I don't know about you, but we've been having some lovely weather recently. I mean, it's what I'd call F11 weather, rather than the usual F5.6 or F8 weather we have here in the UK. And this just makes me want to get out there and shoot, though personally I've not had much opportunity for that recently. But I'm looking forward to next month. I'm running in fact, next week, I'm running a politically themed workshop in London. And these are always good fun. This is more documentary than street, but there's that nice kind of crossover bit in the middle where street and documentary climb into bed together quite happily. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention how grateful I am to you lot for your support of the Street Photography podcast. When I started doing this a few months ago, I had no idea how it would all pan out, and I had horrible visions of me talking to myself like Billy No Mates. But quite honestly, it's taken off beyond all my expectations, and there's now quite a big following, so thank you for that. Now, a few people have been asking about my YouTube channel, and somebody had the temerity to say, is it dead? Well, of course it's not dead. It's been taking a well-earned break, but it's coming back. And the first video it's coming back with is part 2 of Are You New to Street Photography, and some tips for people new to street photography. And then I've got a whole program of stuff that I'm going to deal with. So YouTube isn't dead. It is coming back. So please don't worry about that. Right, enough of the relaxing music. Let's get serious again. For street photographers who travel, the issue of cultural sensitivity is probably quite relevant. Just remember that when you're traveling, you're an outsider, you're a tourist. So you're different. You could be different. You could be wealthier, have different ethnicity to the people around you. So there's often an invisible power dynamic. You have the camera, the platform, and the ability to do what you want with an image. Your subject usually doesn't. Now, this matters more in places where, for example, poverty is visible, or where cultural practices are private or sacred, or where people are being used to be having their picture taken without their agency. And here, the ethical question becomes less about, can I take this? And more about, what am I taking from this moment? Then there's the risk of othering, which means that photographing people from cultures different to yours can very easily slip into framing people as exotic or strange or symbolic, rather than as fully human beings, normal people just like you. And othering has a long history. If we look at colonial era photography and subsequent critiques by thinkers like Susan Sontag, who warned about turning people into visual objects for consumption. So a useful checkpoint is to ask yourself whether you're showing complexity and individuality. Are you applying your own norms onto someone else's environment? I hope that all this doesn't sound a bit kind of woke and snowflakey, but I think it's something that we do need to consider. Now, what about photographing children? What are the ethics of this? Let's take another of your questions. This one from Paul, who seems to have a problem with wind.
Hi Brian, this is Paul Graber from Guildford. I'm anxious that we've been too speedy to prohibit photographs of children in all circumstances. For instance, in Guildford we have an annual pancake race up Guildford High Street. Fully clothed children go up the high street with pancakes in pans. Why on earth should we not be able to take photographs of that? Interested in your view. Cheers.
Well, it's a sad world we live in, Paul. Look at the great work of street photographers like Helen Levitt or Shirley Baker. Imagine trying to take those sort of images today. The usual arguments about public space and artistic freedom don't exactly disappear with this, but they become harder to defend, I think, without some careful thought. So there are a few tensions here that we just need to be aware of and think through a bit. So firstly, the issue of consent. It's murkier with kids, and it's more important. Legally, children can't meaningfully give informed consent. So you're implicitly relying on a parent or guardian who often isn't present at the scene when you're taking the picture, and they have no idea what's going on. That in itself doesn't necessarily make the picture unethical, but it shifts a fair bit of responsibility onto you as the photographer. And the question now becomes, would a reasonable parent feel this was okay? Now, this is a far higher bar than is it legal? And, this is always one of the ethical things that comes up when we're talking about street photography. It might be legal, but is it the right thing to do? And we've got to make this distinction. So secondly, when photographing kids, the power imbalance is amplified. Street photography already involves an imbalance between the photographer and the subject. And with children, that gap widens. They're less able to understand what you're doing, to resist, or to challenge being photographed. So this makes candid work a bit more ethically sensitive, especially if the picture frames them in a way they couldn't anticipate or even later object to. And then thirdly, and probably the most important one, we need to carefully consider safety and downstream use. We live in a dangerous age, a dangerous online age. And in this digital age, it's very easy to lose control of how images circulate. Pictures of children can be copied, misused, manipulated, or end up in contexts that you never intended. Now, that doesn't mean you should never publish, but it does mean you should think carefully about identifiability, location clues, and whether the image could put a child at risk. Imagine taking a picture of a kid who is in some sort of protective guardianship, some kind of safeguarding situation. The last thing you want to do is expose their whereabouts. Just an example. So always ask yourself, would you be comfortable if it were your child or relative? Okay, at this point, I'll take a few more of your questions on ethics generally, because it's quite interesting to hear what your concerns are. So this first one is from Steve.
Hi, Brian. It's Steve Eckersley from Bolton in Greater Manchester, formerly known for Lancashire, which we're more proud of. My question is, I've over the years played about with, street photography. I just love the architecture and the changes, through the years, and I like looking back at older ones, especially the black and whites. But obviously living in a small town, it's not as easy as a city. I was very lucky to go to Lisbon on a cruise recently. I have a little XT50 Fuji, and it was sheer pleasure because the place is so big and bustling that nobody takes any notice. It's really good. I had a very unfortunate experience when I got the Fuji in Colwyn Bay in Wales, where a couple with a child who I was only trying the camera out and just took a picture trying it, and they were quite, slightly abusive. I removed the picture and apologised. But yeah, I just wondered, on smaller places, smaller towns, what would be your advice to, because I do love our town and there's some amazing, characters, if you like, which, I've done a little bit, but I'd just like your advice on that. Thank you.
Hi, Steve. Well, these encounters are always unpleasant, and it's a sad fact of modern life, I'm afraid. It's happened to us all at some point, and it's going to happen again at some point. We've just got to be a bit careful out there. But children aside, your question is about difficulties in shooting in a small versus a large town, I think. So this isn't quite so much about ethics. It's more about how people perceive us as photographers. Generally, I think small towns are more insular. And what's normal in London may not be normal in Chipping Norton or indeed Bolton. And if you're walking around with a camera around your neck, you'll certainly stand out more in a small town. People are not as used to seeing people with cameras and you may look and you may feel a bit odd. So if I'm shooting in a small town, I'll probably think more about, I'll think more carefully before taking a picture. And I may even have a different focus. Maybe my work will be more aesthetic in nature. So I'm not really concerned so much with faces, like Saul Leiter wasn't concerned with faces. Or maybe I'll do something a bit more documentary, which, you know, when you're shooting a documentary project, you automatically have quite a nice backstory and a nice excuse to be taking pictures. Anyway, good luck, Steve. Please don't give up. It's very easy to let these bad experiences put us off, and we really mustn't. And I do need to convince you that it happens to us all. So, next question from Gordon, who makes an interesting point here.
Hello, Brian. Gordon here. I have been an amateur photographer for a long time, working mainly on projects involving landscapes, still life, nature, and recently street photography. And for an outlet, I have made presentations on these topics at my local camera club in Hamilton, Scotland. My question is, most professional street photographers, including yourself, recommend street lenses around 24 to 35 millimetre, requiring the photographer to get really close to subject. Is this more or less ethical than using, say, an 80 millimetre or 120 millimetre lens?
Well, that's a very relevant question. Thanks, Gordon. My own view is that with a wider lens, you're more visible and potentially open about what you're doing in the way that, say, Meyerowitz or Winogrand operated. The danger of using a long lens, and I would call anything longer than about 50 mil is a long lens. The danger with this is that it could appear that you're hiding in the bushes or peering out from behind the bike sheds. You're not out in the open and being obvious and honest and open about your intentions. And it does come back to this word, intentions. If you look at how Saul Leiter operated, he shot mainly with a longer lens, anything from 90 to 150 mil. But his intention wasn't to hide away. It was to create a different aesthetic, a sense of detachment, maybe voyeurism, but not voyeurism in a creepy way, more in the sense of creating an aesthetic that hinted at looking into somebody else's world, looking in on another world. And of course, his work was often quite abstracted anyway. He wasn't interested. He always said he was never interested in shooting people's faces. He found their backs more interesting or their shapes. So to answer your question from an ethical perspective, your own intention is the key factor here. And it comes back to the I word. It's all about intent. So the final question is from Chris.
Hi, Brian. Loving the podcast. I've been thinking about a question from my own line of work. With how powerful reverse image searching is now, do you think taking photographs of people in an unflattering or even slightly unfavourable way has more impact than it used to? Because it feels like people aren't really anonymous anymore once an image is out there. Does that change how we think about the photographer's responsibility? And if someone comes across a photo of themselves like that, do you think they should be able to ask for it to be taken down? And even if they don't technically have that right, are there situations where you choose to remove it anyway?
Thanks, Chris. Interesting. On the subject of taking pictures which are, let's say, unflattering, this isn't something that would be a concern at the front of my mind, to be honest. I just want to record life as it happens. I'm not looking to flatter people, as I would say with a portrait, and if they don't like it because their hair was a mess or whatever, then that's really their problem, not mine. So I don't think that people can... I don't think the fact that people can do reverse image searches and so on puts any more responsibility on us. The fact that they're out in public, they're constantly being recorded by Waitrose, by McDonald's, by Network Rail, by Keir Starmer, or whatever it is. If they're worried about all this, then maybe they just need to take a little extra care over what they're doing or how they look. It's a fact of modern life that we are recorded everywhere we go. And, you know, our pictures are just adding to the mix. And with the way society is heading, I think there's a real danger that we just get infected by people's resistance to having their picture taken and their fears about identity theft. And, you know, people quote all kinds of completely non-relevant legislation to you, like GDPR and privacy laws, which, you know, is not relevant in any way to all of this. So I think we just got to put that at the back of our heads, Chris, and just carry on. Well, I hope I've presented some of the arguments there. And I'd say, in summing up, we're all different. And I said this a few times. What's right for me may not be what's right for you. Street photographers are observers, and there will always be the nagging question of, at what point does observing life become taking something from it? And the answer to that question isn't straightforward or a binary one. There's a scale, and you will find yourself somewhere on that scale. And your own moral compass will tell you exactly where you are on that scale. Only you know. But the central point that I keep returning to is the issue of intent. This word has probably come up more than any other today because it's so critical to our thinking. Street photographers often defend their work based on intent. I meant no harm. But the subjects don't experience your intent. They experience impact. So you could say that our critical question now becomes, what's the impact of me taking this picture? Does my intention outweigh the possible consequences for the subject? Only you know. So the purpose of this episode was not to give you all the answers on ethics, but to present you with some of the questions that you should be asking yourself. So I know you're going to ask me, where do I stand on all this? Well, I probably made some of my views quite clear. Look, I've been doing this for a long time, and so I think I can offer quite an informed perspective. And this is also a personal one. I think people are now much more aware of their human rights, and there's a worrying mission creep towards people being irrationally suspicious or concerned about having their picture taken. But in the absence of any mitigating factors such as vulnerability, I think that suspicion or concern is their problem, not mine. I know in my heart of hearts that my intentions are honourable and that I'm not doing anything wrong. So I'm good to go. And that, my friends, sums up my position on ethics. I hope this has been useful. Join me in a couple of weeks for a normal episode. Bye for now. And if you're still with me at this point, please don't forget the YouTube channel.